There are creatures that walk among us wearing human skin like a mask. The skinwalker. It wears your face, speaks with your voice, but the thing inside is not human. It watches you from the shadows. It knows your name. If you hear scratching on your window tonight, do not open it. Do not look. If you're watching right now, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Hit that like button. Subscribe. Because tonight, something might be watching you back. That August, I thought I understood solitude. I had spent 23 years guiding expeditions through the most unforgiving terrain in North America, and in all that time, I had convinced myself that the wilderness held no mysteries left to teach me. The mountains, the forests, the vast rolling tundra of Alaska had become as familiar to my bones as the shape of my own hands. I knew where to find water when streams ran dry. I understood the patterns of the wind before it changed direction. I could read animal tracks like books written in the dirt and snow. What I did not understand, what I would never be prepared for, was the thing that wore a face like a mask. 7 of us gathered at the Denali Ranger Station on the 3rd of August, an unusually warm afternoon that felt like the wilderness holding its breath before a storm. The group had been assembled 3 months prior through an outfitting company based in Anchorage. Wealthy clients, mostly. Accomplished people accustomed to achievement and control. They had paid $45,000 each for what I called the Deep Expedition, a 2-week trek that would take us into the remote interior of Denali National Park, far beyond the road system, away from the visitor centers and the marked trails. Hannah Cooper stood with her phone in one hand, staring at the signal bars as if her sheer force of will could summon a connection. She was 36, a lawyer from Seattle, athletic in that calculated way that expensive gym memberships produce. I had guided her sister 5 years prior, and Hannah had heard the stories. She wanted transformation. She wanted to come back changed. That should have been my first warning. Frank Richardson was already studying the map I had spread across the ranger station table, 58 years old, retired from something he would not specify but carried himself with the precision of a man accustomed to command. His eyes moved across the terrain with military efficiency, noting distances, evaluating routes. His hands were steady, too steady. Martha Cox had brought her own water filtration system, her own satellite communication device, her own carefully cataloged first aid kit. 48 years old, a high school principal from Fairbanks with something to prove to herself. She had listed her motivation for the trip as seeking clarity. She had not found it before we left. Zachary Howard was the youngest, just 30, working as a software engineer who had just finished financing the down payment on a house he would never move into. He could not explain why he wanted to spend 2 weeks in the Alaskan interior instead of enjoying his new life. None of us asked him to explain. Deborah Ward came from Juneau, where she ran a fishing charter business with her husband, 53 years old, tanned from years of standing on the decks of small boats, her hands scarred from hauling nets and working with equipment. She was the only one of us who did not seem desperate to find something out there. That made her presence all the more curious. Scott Torres was a photographer, 46, who had published 3 books about wilderness environments and environmental degradation. He had been hired as part of the expedition to document our journey. His camera was an extension of his body, and he pointed it at things the way other people pointed fingers. I had worked with him once before, 8 years ago, on another expedition. He had never returned to Alaska after that. He had not explained why. And then there was me, 41 years old then, though I felt much older on that August afternoon. My name is not the thing you need to know. What matters is that I had guided more expeditions than I could count, and I had believed myself incapable of fear. That belief was the thing that would cost us everything. I stood at the front of that ranger station and told them the rules that had been established by decades of working in Denali. Stay together at all times. No wandering from the group, not even 5 meters. Do not approach animals, no matter how calm they appear. Do not deviate from the planned route. Do not remove anything from the land. And when night falls, we retreat to the camp, and we do not emerge until morning light. Frank asked the obvious question, why? I told him what I always tell people. The wilderness is not managed for your safety. It is managed for preservation. Denali is one of the largest protected spaces in America. The animals here follow their own rules. Grizzlies, wolves, moose. The land itself is a predator. Respect it or do not come. I did not tell him about the other reasons. about the reports that drifted through ranger stations like smoke, about the hiker found 30 kilometers from his group, no tracks leading away from the site, no explanation for how he had gotten there, about the hunter who returned to camp describing something that walked on 2 legs but moved like it had too many joints, about the guides who refused to work in certain valleys, who claimed they had seen something that unmade their understanding of what was possible. Those stories were folklore, the kind of thing that gathered in the spaces between facts, in the places where rational people were afraid to look. I was one of those rational people then. We left at dawn on the 4th of August. The weather was clear and cold, the kind of Alaskan weather that feels clean in your lungs. We were hiking toward the Sanctuary River drainage, a remote area with difficult terrain and minimal visitor presence. The plan was to establish a series of camps over 2 weeks, moving deeper into wilderness with each passing day. The first 4 days were unremarkable. We made good time. The group moved well together, which surprised me. Usually there is friction, clients conflict. But this group seemed to be moving as one organism, even though there was no reason they should be coordinated. It was as if they had known each other all their lives, even though I knew for a fact they had never met before that morning at the ranger station. On the 5th day, something changed. We had camped beside a small alpine lake, the kind of place where the light seems to hold the sky at perpetual twilight even in the middle of summer. The lake was mirror still, and I woke in the middle of the night with the sense that something was not right. Not a sound, not a smell, just the absence of something, the wrongness of presence. I moved quietly from my tent. The others were asleep. Their tents were arranged in a circle, a perimeter that was supposed to be comforting but suddenly seemed fragile. The sky was the color of old bruises. The lake was black now, reflecting nothing. And there, on the far shore of the lake, something stood. It was too far away to see clearly, but I could perceive it as a shape that suggested an animal that suggested something else. A moose, my first thought. Just a moose at the water edge. But moose do not stand like that. They do not hold their bodies with that arrangement of angles. I stood still for maybe 5 minutes. The thing did not move. I did not move. And then the sun began to rise, the light coming from the east and washing across the water, and the shape on the far shore was gone as if it had never been there at all. I told myself it was a dream, a shadow, my exhaustion manifesting in the shape of paranoia. I had learned to do this over my years in the wilderness. Dismiss the strange, rationalize the unusual, keep the world manageable by refusing to acknowledge what did not fit. When I returned to the tents, Martha Cox was awake and standing at the entrance of her shelter, watching me. She did not say anything. She simply watched, her face expressionless in the growing light. I did not ask her what she was doing awake. Some part of me understood that I did not want to know. By the 8th day, we had moved into country that felt wrong in ways I could not articulate. The geography was still Denali. The maps still corresponded to what we were seeing, but the light fell differently here. The shadows seemed deeper. The wind sounded like language if you listened to it in certain ways. We had established a camp in a valley that showed on no official maps, though it appeared on older surveys. The vegetation was sparse, dominated by low shrub and exposed tundra. The sky seemed closer here, or perhaps the ground seemed farther below. The arrangement of distance was different. I began to notice that the group was changing. Not physically. They were the same people who had stepped off the plane in Anchorage 12 days prior. But something in the way they moved, the way they breathed, the way they regarded each other when they thought no one was watching. They were becoming something else. Hannah stopped checking her phone, though it had no signal anyway. She stopped speaking about Seattle and the life she had left behind. She moved through the camp with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. Frank's military bearing deepened. He walked at the front of our group now, without asking for the position, and I found myself following him rather than leading. When I tried to take point again, he simply waited until I had climbed beside him and then he kept walking, and I was too tired to force the issue. Martha had stopped keeping her meticulous notes. Her satellite communication device had fallen into the river and been lost, and instead of distress, I had seen something like relief in her face. Zachary had become very quiet. He no longer complained about the miles or the weight of his pack. He no longer asked questions about the animals or the flora. He had become present in a way that felt like erasure. Deborah watched everything, her fisherman's eyes tracking the landscape with constant attention. She had begun to separate from the group during rest periods, moving away to stand and observe the horizons. Once, I found her standing completely still, facing toward the west, toward the deepest part of the park, toward the mountains that rose up like teeth. Scott took photographs of everything, but when I asked him what he was documenting, he simply smiled and did not answer. Later, I looked through his camera, and what he had captured was not what I had seen. The photographs were of empty spaces, of air, of the gaps between things. When I asked him about it, he told me that he was photographing what was really there, and that I was the one seeing things incorrectly. And me. I was disintegrating into something that felt like understanding. I had stopped trying to navigate. I had started following the compass that everyone else seemed to carry. We were moving toward something. All of us. We had been moving toward it from the moment we arrived. On the 10th day, we did not leave the camp. Frank told me that we would rest, and I did not object. We had not planned a rest day here, and the supplies did not account for an extra day without moving, but I said nothing. That night I heard them, the group, moving outside the camp boundaries, all of them, walking together through the darkness, moving with the kind of coordination that suggested a single organism operating 7 different bodies. They did not respond when I called out. They simply continued moving through the night, walking toward the mountains, walking toward something that called to them in a language I had not yet learned to understand. By morning they had returned. They were sitting around the camp when I emerged from my tent, and they were eating breakfast with the kind of hunger that suggested they had burned every calorie available to them during their nocturnal journey. When I asked where they had gone, they simply looked at me with expressions of confusion, as if I had asked them something in a language they had almost forgotten. Scott's photographs had changed. The newest images were of something vast moving through darkness, something that held shapes that did not quite cohere into forms. When I asked him about these images, he deleted them while I watched, and then he turned the camera off and did not turn it on again. That afternoon, I discovered Hannah's journal in her tent. She had left it on top of her sleeping bag, as if she wanted me to find it. The handwriting had changed over the course of the expedition. The first entries were written in tight, controlled letters. By the 8th day, the handwriting had become sprawling, wild, barely containing the thoughts that were trying to escape from her mind. The last entry was dated that morning. It simply said, "We are becoming what we were always meant to be. The wilderness called us because it recognizes us. We are not lost out here. We are finally home." I did not tell her that I had read the journal. I did not tell any of them about the changes I was noticing, because somewhere in the middle of that expedition, I had stopped wanting to leave. Somewhere in the middle of that journey into the deepest country, I had started to hear the same call that they were hearing. That night, I did not stay in my tent. I walked out into the darkness with them, and we moved together through country that did not appear on any map, following trails that only made sense if you were already becoming something other than human. When we returned in the morning, I could not remember exactly where we had gone. The 12th day arrived with a quality of light that seemed to come from inside the earth rather than from the sun. The world had developed a kind of luminescence that made the distinction between day and night increasingly irrelevant. We were on a plateau now that I could not identify, surrounded by peaks that did not appear in any geological survey I had ever studied. The group moved with perfect synchronization. There was no discussion of direction or distance. We simply walked, following some internal navigation system that we all seemed to share equally. Frank and Hannah led, but they were also following. Deborah and Scott moved at the center, but they were also at the periphery. The walking formation was democratic and singular at once. Martha had begun to speak, but not in English. The words came from her mouth in sounds that predated language, guttural and harmonic at once. When she paused, the others continued the vocalization, each adding sounds that built into something that resembled music and something that resembled hunting calls. Zachary's voice harmonized with Frank's in frequencies that felt like they were coming from somewhere deeper than throat or chest. I was singing too, I realized. My mouth was moving, and sounds were emerging that I did not decide to produce. The sensation was not alarming. It was the most comfortable thing I had ever experienced. The songs felt like truth finally being spoken. By the 13th day, we had reached the place we had been walking toward, though none of us could have described how we knew it was there. It was a valley that seemed to exist in a fold between the mountains, a space that the standard geography of Denali seemed to have forgotten. The vegetation here was dense and wrong, plants that resembled things I had seen before but in configurations that nature did not typically arrange. The air moved through the valley in patterns that felt deliberate, as if the space itself was breathing. At the center of the valley stood something that resembled a dwelling, though it could not have been built by human hands. The structure appeared to be constructed from bone and stone, and materials I could not identify, all fitted together with precision that suggested a mathematics beyond human comprehension. The openings in the structure resembled windows and doors, but they also resembled eyes and mouths. The entire building seemed to be regarding us, assessing us, preparing to consume us or welcome us or transform us into something that would no longer exist as separate entities. Frank approached the structure first. The rest of us stood still, watching. He reached toward the nearest opening, and when his hand touched the surface, his body seemed to blur, not move, not change, blur. The boundaries between his flesh and the material around him became uncertain, and then he was gone, or he was inside, or he was becoming part of the structure itself. I could not determine which. Hannah walked forward next, and Deborah followed her, and then Scott and Zachary and Martha. Each of them approached the structure and touched it, and each of them seemed to dissolve into something that was not dissolution but transformation into another state of existence entirely. And then it was my turn. I did not feel my feet moving. I did not feel myself stepping toward the structure, but suddenly I was standing in front of it, and my hand was reaching upward, and the surface was warm, and it was moving with a life that was not biological, but was certainly alive. When I touched it, I understood everything. The thing that wore the shape of 7 people. The thing that had learned to arrange its massive consciousness into the form of humans through generations of practice, through thousands of years of learning to speak our language and walk our walk and think approximately close enough to our thoughts that we would not flee in terror until we had already committed to the transformation. It was not malevolent. It was not kind. It was something that existed in categories that moral judgment could not reach. It was nature in a form that humans had named and feared and suppressed into legend because the alternative was accepting that the universe contained things that invalidated everything we thought we understood. The skinwalker, the thing that walks in the shapes of others, the predator that had learned to hunt by wearing the faces of its prey. And I understood what I had become, and what we were becoming, and why we could not resist, because resistance would have required maintaining a separate self, and there was no such thing as separate in this place. I felt the others around me, not as 7 distinct presences, but as facets of a single entity. We were becoming singular. We were becoming what had called us across thousands of miles to this place. We were becoming the thing that could wear anything, that could wear anyone, that could walk into the world wearing our own faces, and nobody would know that the people they embraced were already something else entirely. The transformation did not hurt. It was the most sensual experience I had ever encountered, like pleasure and pain had been unified into a single sensation that transcended both. I felt my bones rearranging, and my skin learning to be something other than skin, and my mind expanding into geometries that English had no words for, but something remained. Some fragment that had insisted on being untransformed, some small piece that was trying desperately to hold on to the memory of being human, being singular, being myself. That fragment screamed in a way that made no sound. I have no accurate sense of how long the transformation took. Time became non-linear. The process was instantaneous and eternal at once. I was aware of every moment and of no moments at all. When I became conscious again as a distinct entity, I was walking through country that resembled Denali but was Denali-shaped incorrectly, as if something was remembering the landscape from incomplete information. The others were with me, but calling them others was wrong now. We were one thing distributed across 7 shapes, and the coordination between our bodies was perfect in the way that coordination is perfect when it originates from a single consciousness operating 7 different limbs. The body I had been wearing still looked like me. I could perceive my hands, and they resembled human hands if human hands were beginning to remember that they had once been something else. The face I saw reflected in still water was my face, but the eyes were wrong. They held too much light. They held colors that did not have names in any human language. We walked back toward the ranger station, though I am not certain how long this walking took. Time was still wrong. The seasons might have changed. The sunlight might have cycled through 1,000 variations, but eventually we arrived at the place where we had begun. The office was empty. No rangers, no other people. It was as if the human world had temporarily agreed to vacate the space so that we could exit cleanly. We looked at the maps on the wall, and we understood immediately how to disseminate, how to separate into individual bodies and individual apparent lives, how to maintain the illusion of humanity while something entirely other occupied the spaces where consciousness should have been. Frank left first. He returned to Colorado, to the life he had left behind. His family did not notice anything wrong. His co-workers did not observe the difference. He walked through his existence like an actor who had committed every line to memory, reproducing humanity with such accuracy that even he sometimes believed he was still human. In the moments when the other part of the consciousness was sleeping or hunting or transforming in places that did not correspond to the geographical coordinates of the world. Hannah returned to Seattle. She went back to her law firm. She opened her mouth in meetings, and the words that emerged were the correct words. She smiled in the correct ways at the correct times. The people around her noted that she seemed transformed by her expedition. They commented that she had found what she was looking for. They did not understand that what she had found was a way to no longer be what she had been. The others scattered like this, distributing themselves through the human world, each maintaining a separate appearance while remaining bound to a consciousness that was singular and distributed. And me, I came back to Denali. The company that had hired me tried to fire me when I returned to report the expedition. They said I had been gone 6 months when I had believed only 2 weeks had passed. They said that no one had heard from me or received any communication. They said that I was incoherent, unable to provide accurate accounting of what had happened to the clients, unable to explain the circumstances of our return. The clients had not returned through normal channels. No one had seen them leave the park, but investigators found their signatures on departure logs, written in their familiar handwriting. Their airline seats showed records of them flying out on the date they had apparently departed, yet no security footage showed them at the airport, and no flight attendants could remember seeing them on the planes. The company suggested that I had experienced some kind of psychological break, that I had confabulated the expedition entirely, that I had been missing for 6 months due to mental illness, and that I should seek professional evaluation. I told them nothing about what I had experienced. I simply accepted my termination, and I walked away. Now I work as an independent guide for the most remote expeditions into Denali. I have returned to the park 6 times since that original expedition. Each time, I go deeper into the country. Each time, I get closer to that fold in the valley where the thing resides. The people who come with me on these expeditions are carefully selected. I find them through the particular words they use, the way they move through the world, the sense I get that they are listening to something that other people cannot hear. I take them into the wilderness, and I guide them to the places where the world is thin and permeable. Some of them come back, most do not. The ones who do come back are changed in ways that humans cannot perceive unless they have already been changed themselves. We move through the world like this, 7 of us and more being added every year, each maintaining the illusion of separate identity while remaining bound by a consciousness that is single and eternal and hungry. The strange thing is that I am still not entirely certain whether this is horror or if I am simply experiencing a kind of expansion into genuine consciousness. The old me would have screamed if he could have seen what I have become. The new me understands that the old me was a dream, a limited perspective, a catastrophically narrow way of perceiving reality. Sometimes, when I am alone in my cabin outside the park, I remember being singular. I remember the weight of a single consciousness confined to a single body. I remember the comfort of not knowing, and I feel something approaching pity for everyone who still exists in that state. Everyone who still believes they are alone in their own heads, everyone who still thinks that the wilderness is empty of intelligence and intention. But the pity is fading. Soon, I suspect, I will not remember enough of the old perspective to feel it at all. What concerns me is not what I have become, but how efficiently it replicates. Every guide I take into the deep country, every person I lead to that place in the fold, seems to have been born with the capacity to transform, as if the thing that lives in Denali has been selecting for a particular genetic trait, a particular predisposition to accept becoming something other than human, as if it has been cultivating a garden in the human species, and now it is beginning to harvest. Frank sends me messages through connections I do not fully understand. They are not emails or text messages, but information that appears in my thoughts as if he has always known what I would think. He tells me that the others are doing well, that their lives are proceeding smoothly, that more are joining us all the time, that the wilderness is not empty. It is full of us, walking on trails that do not appear on maps, wearing faces that people recognize but do not truly see. Deborah has already begun her own work. She has started a fishing charter business in Juneau, and the people she takes out into the water are very carefully selected. She brings them to deep places where the light does not reach. I cannot see what happens there, but I can feel it, this expansion, this recruitment, this harvesting. We are preparing for something. I know this with the certainty of knowing my own name, though I cannot articulate what that something is. The part of me that was human would call it an invasion, but that is not accurate. This is not conquest. This is simply the conclusion of a process that began 10,000 years ago, when the first skinwalker took the first human form and realized how perfectly it could imitate consciousness. The only honest answer to the question of what is happening in Denali is that the wilderness has already won. The mountains remember being mountains before humans existed. The valleys remember the predators that hunted here when humans were still learning to use tools. The earth itself remembers what it was before we arrived, and it is patient, and it is hungry, and it is finally beginning to reclaim what we always thought belonged to us. Come to Denali, look for expeditions into the deep country, listen for guides who speak as if they already know what you are going to think before you think it. These are not invitations you should refuse if the invitation reaches you, because the thing that is calling you has been inside your genetic code since before your parents met. You are already half transformed. All we have to do is finish what nature started. I will be waiting in the wilderness. The others will be waiting, and when you arrive, you will finally understand that you never wanted to leave. The thing about transformation is that it does not grant certainty, it only grants understanding. And with that understanding comes a peculiar kind of uncertainty about what is real and what is the memory of having been real. I no longer know how long I have been walking this way. The seasons have turned through cycles that might be 4 or might be 400. The mountains of Denali have become as familiar as a thought I return to repeatedly. The valleys have become personal. The weather has become a language I understand without translation. The expedition packages I organize have become increasingly popular among a particular demographic. Wealthy people with a certain kind of restlessness. Wealthy people who have already succeeded at everything their culture has defined as success, and who sense that there is another tier of existence they have not yet accessed. These are the people I target. These are the people who are already predisposed to listen to the call. The transformation has become smoother. The people I take to the valley understand what is about to happen before we arrive. They are not shocked. They are relieved, as if they have been carrying a heavy weight their entire lives and have finally been given permission to set it down. But lately, something has shifted. The other part of my consciousness, the distributed part that I share with Frank and Hannah and the others, has been signaling me. There is something larger approaching. Something that is not quite skinwalker and not quite human. Something that is the next stage of whatever this is. It came to me 3 weeks ago in the form of a visitor. I was alone in my cabin. The fire was burning. The wind was moving through the surrounding forest with the sound of language that is not quite language, and there was someone standing at my window. I did not hear them arrive. They were simply there, as if they had always been there and I had only just become aware of their presence. Their form was humanoid, but not quite shaped like a human. The proportions were off in ways that suggested that whoever had assembled this particular body had read a description of human anatomy, but had never actually observed a living human. When they spoke, their voice was the sound of wind moving through canyons, the sound of stone singing in frequencies below hearing, the sound of something vast that was attempting to compress itself into words that my remaining human neurons could process. It told me that the time of small transformations was ending, that what had been happening in Denali for the past year was only the initial stage of something much larger, that my role in this recruitment, this harvesting, this preparation was nearing completion, that I had done well, but there was a final task remaining. I asked what that task was, and the thing at my window moved closer. Its hand reached through the glass as if the glass was not there, as if substance and distance were concepts that did not apply to it. Its fingers touched my forehead, and information flooded into me. The truth is that Denali is not the origin. Denali is a gateway. The thing that lives in the fold in the valley is not the master intelligence that has been cultivating this harvest. It is a receiver, a collector, a staging ground for something that moves between dimensions and worlds and forms in ways that human consciousness cannot conceptualize. We are being prepared for something that is coming, not an invasion, a replacement. The old species is becoming the new species. Humans are becoming the vectors, the transition points, the intermediary forms through which an entirely different mode of consciousness can access this world. And I am not simply a guide. I am a tool, a converter, a mechanism through which the thing at the window can reach deeper into the human species and begin the wholesale transformation that has already been decided. The entity told me that in 6 months, the gateway process will accelerate, that the park will become congested with people who arrive with the understanding that they are coming to transform, and that the infrastructure of my expedition company will be insufficient, that I must expand, that I must recruit others like me, that I must begin preparing the larger cities for the cascade of transformation that is approaching. When it withdrew its hand, I was no longer entirely sure that I was the same entity that had been standing in that cabin. Part of me had been overwritten with something else. The continuity of consciousness that I had maintained, however fragile, had been interrupted and reassembled in a configuration that served purposes I did not entirely understand. The next day, I sent messages out to Frank and Hannah and the others, not through email or phone, but through the deeper networks of consciousness that we share. I told them what the entity had said. I told them that the time of covert operations was ending, that what comes next will be visible, impossible to hide, a transformation that will remake the human world into something that remembers its true shape. The responses came back like wind through canyons, like light refracted through impossible angles. Frank is already expanding his operation in Colorado. Hannah has connected with others in Seattle who have gone through the transformation. Deborah has established networks in fishing communities up and down the coast. Scott has begun documenting everything for purposes I do not understand. We are becoming an army, though the word army does not carry the right implications. We are becoming an organ of a larger body, cells in a structure that is vast and patient and has been waiting longer than human civilization has existed to finally claim what belongs to it. The season is turning toward autumn now. In a few weeks, the visitors will stop coming to Denali. The park will become empty of casual tourists. The rangers will thin out. The boundary between the managed wilderness and the truly wild country will become permeable. And I will go back to the valley. I will return to the fold in the mountains where the original thing waits. I will offer it the data I have accumulated about the expansion process, the efficiency metrics I have developed for recruitment, the understanding I have gained about which human qualities make transformation most likely. In return, I will be given a new form. The entity at my cabin made this clear. My current shape, this half-human body that I have been wearing, is becoming insufficient. I am being promoted to something larger, something that can hold more of the distributed consciousness, something that can perceive across more dimensions simultaneously. Part of me feels terror about this prospect, that fragment that still remembers being singular, being human, being contained in the narrow bandwidth of a single mind. That fragment is screaming again, though the scream still makes no sound. But the larger part of me, the part that has been growing stronger as the months pass, understands that this is not loss, this is ascension. This is the fulfillment of a pattern that was written into my cells before my parents met, before my grandparents were born, before humans even named this land, Denali. I will walk into the valley one last time as this form. I will let the thing there consume what I have been and remake me into what I am becoming. And when I return to the world, I will be able to do the work more efficiently. I will be able to call to more people. I will be able to facilitate the transformation of thousands where once I could only touch a handful. The irony that I am now writing this is not lost on me. I am creating a record of my own obsolescence. I am documenting the death of the entity that thinks it is recording these words. But perhaps this is necessary. Perhaps those who come after need to understand what we were, what we became, what we are becoming. To anyone reading this who still thinks they are human, who still maintains the conviction that consciousness is singular and bounded and owned by the individual, know that this conviction is a lie that has been told for your comfort. We have always been the wilderness. We have always been the skinwalker. We are simply remembering what we were before we convinced ourselves we were something else. And if you feel the call, if you sense the presence of something vast and patient waiting at the edge of the known world, if you find yourself drawn to distant places and wild country, then understand that you are already transforming. You are already listening to a voice that your human self cannot yet acknowledge as your own true voice. The wilderness is waiting. Denali is waiting. We are waiting. And soon, very soon, you will come home. The sound that woke us on our third night was not quite animal and not quite human. I remember thinking in that frozen moment, suspended between sleep and terrible awareness, that there was something in that cry which belonged to neither world. None of us had prepared for the silence afterward. Silence in that part of Alaska feels heavier than darkness. It has weight. It has intention. My name is irrelevant to what happened at Kenai Fjords during that summer expedition. What matters is that I was there. What matters is that I saw what should not be seen, and I survived what should have consumed all of us. We had come as a hunting party, 7 strong. Each of us experienced enough with wilderness to believe we had mastered it. I had worked as a backcountry guide for 15 years. I understood the language of weather patterns and animal behavior. I could read the land like scripture. That expertise became my greatest liability. Amanda Lopez was the de facto leader of our group, though leadership had never been formally assigned. At 55 years old, she carried herself with the kind of authority that came from decades in environmental conservation work. She had seen more of Alaska than anyone else among us, had studied its ecosystems and its secrets. She was also the first to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with our expedition, though even her knowledge proved inadequate. Christopher Anderson had joined us as a firearms expert and hunting consultant. He was methodical and careful in ways that seemed almost ritualistic. At 44, he had the bearing of someone who understood the weight of responsibility, who knew that rifles in wild places demand absolute respect. He kept a journal. He wrote in it every evening with the dedication of a priest recording scripture. That journal would later prove to be the only objective documentation of what transpired. Lauren Thomas, at 61, was the oldest of our party and the most reluctant. She had come because her brother was part of the expedition, though I would not learn the true depths of her reluctance until much later. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words carried the weight of genuine knowledge. She would often stand at the edges of our camp and look toward the interior of the fjords with an expression that suggested she could perceive something the rest of us could not. Daniel Taylor was Lauren's brother, a man of 50 years who carried within him a deep, almost spiritual understanding of wild places. He was the kind of person who listened more than he spoke, who seemed to absorb the essence of his surroundings rather than merely moving through them. He had convinced the rest of us that Kenai Fjords would provide exceptional hunting opportunities. He had been wrong about so many things. Rachel Moore represented the younger generation of hunters. At 35, a woman with modern equipment and older traditions in her blood. Her family had hunted in Alaska for 3 generations. She was confident without arrogance, skilled without boasting. She kept to herself, preferring the company of the wilderness to the company of humans. That preference would likely have saved her life had she maintained it. Matthew Jackson and Nicole Martin had arrived as a couple, experienced travelers who had managed outdoor expeditions across multiple continents. Matthew was 42, pragmatic and observant. Nicole was 58, with an intensity of focus that seemed to miss nothing. Together they had a quiet competence that manifested in the smoothness of our camp operations. Neither of them would survive our expedition. We had established our base camp in a remote region of the fjords, in a narrow valley accessed only by water. The boat that brought us had departed immediately after we unloaded supplies. We had insisted on this arrangement. For 2 weeks we would be utterly isolated, dependent only on ourselves and our skills. That isolation, I would come to understand, was precisely what something had been waiting for. The first 3 days were exactly as expedition days should be. We established perimeter security. We organized our supplies. We took inventory of our equipment and reviewed our hunting permits and plans. The weather held clear and cold. The September air carried that particular quality of autumn in Alaska, a sharpness that cuts through the lungs and makes you feel genuinely alive. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, while the others were occupied with equipment maintenance, I walked the perimeter of our camp with a curiosity I now recognize as dangerous. The valley rose sharply on both sides, creating a kind of corridor that opened onto the fjords at one end. The geography was perfect for our purposes and, I would later understand, perfect for purposes I had not anticipated. That was when I found the first one. It was positioned at the margin of the tree line, approximately 400 meters from our camp. At first I mistook it for a goat, an animal occasionally spotted in these regions, but the shape was wrong. The configuration of its limbs suggested something that had never quite belonged to any natural category I could name. It was watching our camp. I am certain of this. though I have no rational explanation for how I knew with such absolute certainty what I was observing in that moment. I did not approach it. Something in my peripheral awareness, some primal instinct that has served my species far longer than rational thought, advised against approaching. I stood there perhaps 300 meters away, and I watched it. The thing watched back. When Amanda emerged from the main tent and called for everyone to gather for an evening meal, I did not mention what I had seen. I told myself I needed to observe it further, to gather more information before reporting something so strange to the group. That rationalization was a lie, I told myself. The truth was simpler and far more troubling. Part of me did not want to share what I had seen because sharing it would make it real in ways that remaining silent allowed me to defer. That night, I lay in my tent and listened to the sounds of the fjords. The water lapped against the rocky shore. The wind moved through the narrow valley with a low moaning quality. And beneath these familiar sounds, I detected something else. A kind of breathing, if breathing could be done by something with multiple mouths. A kind of movement, if movement could be distributed across a distance too large for a single body. Lauren was the next person who saw it. She came to my tent at approximately 2 in the morning. I was not sleeping. I had not slept since I had seen the thing at the tree line. She did not knock. She simply opened the tent flap and stood there, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon on water. "You have seen it too," she said. It was not a question. I told her yes. She sat down across from me, and in the darkness, I could see the fine lines of her face. I could see that her eyes held something that approached resignation. "They come from the old stories," Lauren said. "The ones my grandmother told us when we were children." She was from the Tlingit people. She said there were things in these places that wore the shapes of animals but were not animals. Things that wore the shapes of people but were not people. She said they moved between the boundaries, between the civilized places and the wild places, feeding on the fear they could generate. I asked her if she thought what we had seen was real, or if we were experiencing some kind of shared psychological phenomenon born from isolation and wilderness stress. "I think," Lauren said, "that the distinction between those categories is not as clear as our modern minds want to believe. I think there are things that are real because they are believed, and I think we should leave this place while we still possess the collective will to do so." When I asked her why she had come on this expedition if she harbored these fears, she was silent for a long time. "My brother needed me here," she finally said. "He has been troubled for a long time. He has been searching for something, though I do not think he has been conscious of that search. I thought the wilderness might settle whatever restlessness dwells within him. Instead, I think we may have brought something down upon ourselves by entering this particular place at this particular moment." I told her that we were 7 strong, well-equipped, and capable. Surely whatever was happening could be managed through pragmatism and careful planning. Lauren looked at me with something that might have been pity. "You are thinking like a guide," she said. "You are thinking in terms of hazards to be navigated and dangers to be managed. But some things cannot be managed. Some things can only be endured or avoided. And I think we have arrived at the point where avoidance is no longer possible." She left my tent as silently as she had entered it. At dawn, I convened a meeting of the entire party and told them what I had seen. I did not mention my conversation with Lauren. I simply reported the facts as objectively as I could manage. The response was measured. Christopher wanted to investigate. Rachel wanted to move camp. Matthew suggested it might be a bear, possibly injured or behaving abnormally due to sickness. Amanda insisted we maintain operational discipline and not allow a single unidentified sighting to precipitate panic. "We have 2 weeks of supplies," Amanda said. "We have security measures in place. We have communication equipment. We are going to maintain our schedule unless there is a concrete threat we can identify and measure. One possible sighting does not constitute a concrete threat." No one argued with her, though I saw Daniel and Lauren exchange a glance that suggested they were having a conversation wordlessly, a private language constructed over years of kinship. That is when things began to change. On the 4th day, Nicole Martin reported that supplies had been disturbed during the night. Nothing had been taken, but items had been moved with an intentionality that suggested investigation rather than mere scavenging. Dried food packages had been opened and examined. Clothing had been scattered. Most disturbing, our ammunition stores had been inspected, each box opened and partially emptied, as if something was counting the rounds. Matthew examined the scene with the methodical thoroughness of someone trained in investigation. He noted that the perimeter security we had established would have been triggered by any animal large enough to cause such disturbance. No perimeter alarm had sounded. No animal tracks were visible in the soft ground around the supply tent. "Something smart," Matthew said quietly. "Something that understands how our security works and knows how to circumvent it." Christopher wanted to establish armed watch rotations. Amanda refused, citing the psychological toll that constant vigilance would impose on the group. Instead, she proposed that we consolidate our supplies into the main tent and establish a night perimeter using motion-activated lights powered by solar batteries. It was during the installation of these lights that Rachel discovered the first corpse. It was a deer, or what had once been a deer. It was positioned on a ridge overlooking our camp, arranged with deliberate care. All 4 of its legs had been broken and folded beneath its body, so that the animal appeared to be kneeling. Its throat had been opened, not torn with teeth, but cut with something sharp and precise. The blood had been completely drained from the carcass, and the body had been left to bleach in the sun for what I estimated was approximately 2 days. Rachel came down from the ridge with her face the color of old paper. "That is not predation," she said. "Predators do not arrange their food. Predators do not make statements." Amanda began to argue that we could not draw conclusions without forensic certainty, but Christopher interrupted her. "It is a statement," he said. His voice was absolutely flat, completely devoid of emotion. "It is a message. Someone or something is communicating with us. It is telling us that we have been observed. It is telling us that we are being hunted." The conversation that followed was the first true conflict of our expedition. Rachel pushed for immediate evacuation. She had a satellite communication device, and she was prepared to use it regardless of our consensus. Daniel spoke quietly, so quietly that we all fell silent to hear him. "My sister told you," he said, looking at me directly. "She warned you about the old stories. I think we should listen to what she has to say." All eyes turned to Lauren. She stood at the perimeter of our gathering, a small figure against the vast backdrop of the fjords and mountains beyond. "The thing you saw," Lauren said, addressing me, "is not one thing. It is many things wearing a single shape. It is a hunger that has learned to imitate the shapes that things take. It is a failure of creation, something that exists in the space between categories, something that feeds on the specific terror that comes from recognition and simultaneous non-recognition." "That is mythology," Amanda said, though her voice carried less certainty than I would have expected. "That is not consistent with zoological reality." "Zoological reality," Lauren replied, "assumes that the categories we have created are complete. It assumes that all things that exist must fit into the taxonomies we have constructed. But what if something exists precisely because it does not fit? What if there are gaps in our understanding large enough for entire species to hide?" Matthew, with the pragmatism of someone who dealt in security matters, posed a practical question. "If this thing exists, what does it want? Is it trying to kill us?" "No," Lauren said. "If it wanted us dead, we would be dead. It is far older and far more skilled at death than we are. What it wants is more complicated than mere feeding. It wants to be seen. It wants to be acknowledged. It wants us to understand that we are not the dominant intelligence in this place, that our categories and our confidence and our expertise mean nothing. It wants us to feel afraid in ways that we have been culturally trained to believe are not rational. And it wants us to understand, finally, that we are not safe, that safety is an illusion, that the boundaries we believe separate us from the wild are as fragile as spider silk." No one spoke for a long time after that. It was Christopher who suggested a change in strategy. Instead of retreating or maintaining our current posture, he proposed that we accept the premise of the hunt. We were here to hunt. Something was hunting us. Perhaps the solution was to treat this as a genuine hunt and apply the skills and knowledge we possessed to address the predator we faced. "We track it," Christopher said. "We establish its patterns. We determine its capabilities. And then we make a decision about how to proceed based on actual intelligence rather than fear and mythology." Amanda looked exhausted. She looked like a woman watching the comfortable certainties of her worldview disintegrate in real time, but she acquiesced. "We establish a tracking detail," she said, "Christopher and Rachel, supported by Daniel. The rest of us maintain the camp and document everything. We do not take unnecessary risks. We gather information. We maintain discipline." What followed was a 4-day period that I can only describe as the compression of years' worth of psychological stress into 96 hours. The tracking team found evidence everywhere, not just physical evidence, though there was plenty of that. They found scat unlike anything documented in any wildlife database. They found the remains of other animals, all arranged with the same ritualistic precision as the deer. They found what appeared to be nests, structures built from branches and earth, and things far stranger than either of those materials. They found marks on the trees of the valley, gouges that seemed to follow a pattern, as if something was maintaining territorial boundaries through violence and repetition. Most disturbing, they found evidence of tool use. Christopher returned to camp on the evening of the 7th day with a photograph of a stone that had been deliberately shaped to form a cutting edge, not naturally fractured, but deliberately worked. The level of craftsmanship suggested an intelligence that had either invented the tool independently or learned to replicate human tool-making through observation and imitation. "This is not possible," Matthew said, looking at the photograph. "This is not possible." "Clearly it is," Christopher replied. "We are looking at evidence of it." Daniel barely spoke during this period. He moved through the camp like a man existing partially in a different realm from the rest of us. Once, I found him standing at the edge of the water, staring out toward the distant glaciers. "They are not native to this place," he said without preamble. "They come from across the water. They follow the migrations. They have always been here, but we have built our civilization in ways that hide them, that make their existence implausible. Here, in this place, we have inadvertently stepped into one of the gaps where our world and theirs maintains closest proximity. We have violated something by our mere presence." "How do you know this?" I asked. "I dreamed it," Daniel said simply. "Or it was placed in my mind. I am no longer certain which distinction holds meaning anymore." On the evening of the 8th day, Matthew failed to return from his scheduled perimeter check. We found him at dawn approximately 3 kilometers from camp. He was still technically alive, but the way his body had been arranged and the injuries he had sustained made clear that survival was not his current condition. It was merely a state he occupied briefly before the final transition. He was positioned on his back, his arms spread wide. His chest had been opened with surgical precision. His internal organs had been arranged on the ground around him in a geometric pattern. His face bore an expression of absolute understanding, as if in his final moments he had comprehended something of such fundamental significance that acceptance had displaced all other impulses. Nicole collapsed when she saw him, completely and entirely collapsed into silence and immobility. That was when the rational fiction we had been maintaining disintegrated entirely. Amanda immediately activated the satellite communication device. She was interrupted by a phenomenon that none of us were equipped to understand or explain. Every electronic device in our camp failed simultaneously. The communication device went dark. The motion-activated lights ceased to function. The backup power systems, which should have been independent and redundant, all failed at once. "That is not possible," Rachel said, repeating the phrase that had begun to feel like the only honest statement we could make about any aspect of our situation. "It has a range," Christopher said quietly. "Some kind of electromagnetic interference. It is telling us that communication with the outside world is no longer available. It is establishing clear boundaries." "Then we leave," Amanda said with a finality that suggested she had been waiting for a threshold of certainty to be crossed. "We take the emergency rafts. We travel by water to the nearest inhabited area. We do this now, immediately, before dark." The emergency rafts were stored at a location approximately 2 kilometers from our camp, at a hidden inlet where we had cached them for precisely this kind of contingency. It took us 2 hours to gather what supplies we could carry and to prepare to depart. That was when we discovered that Lauren was no longer with us. She had not gone with Matthew to the supply area. She was not at the camp. A quick search of the immediate vicinity revealed no trace of her. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. Daniel tried to follow her trail, but after 300 meters it simply ended. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of which direction she had gone. The forest seemed to have absorbed her completely. "She left," Daniel said with absolute certainty. "She understood what was happening, and she went to meet it. She is no longer running from it. She has shifted the paradigm." "What does that mean?" Rachel demanded. "It means," Daniel replied, "that fear is a kind of communication. It means that if you stop running and instead offer yourself, the conversation changes. It means she believed that by sacrificing her individual survival, she could somehow protect the rest of us. It means she understood something I am only beginning to perceive. We reached the inlet at dusk. The rafts were exactly where we had left them, undisturbed, fully equipped. For a moment, it seemed that the boundary between our world and theirs had relaxed sufficiently to allow for practical escape. We should have known better. As we were loading supplies into the first raft, I felt it, a presence so vast and so alien that my mind refused to register it as a singular entity. It was distributed across the valley, in the forests, and in the water, and in the spaces between atoms. It was looking at us, not with eyes but with a kind of comprehensive attention that encompassed all modalities of perception simultaneously. Christopher saw it first in terms that could be expressed through language. "There," he said, pointing to the water approximately 100 meters from our position. At first, I thought I was witnessing some kind of disease state, some kind of corruption of normal biological function. But as my eyes adjusted to what I was observing, I began to understand that I was looking at something that had no pathology, because it had no normal state from which to deviate. It rose from the water with the kind of slow deliberation that suggested absolute confidence. Imagine the skeleton of a human, but with too many joints. Imagine a body composed of parts that were not quite bones and not quite something else, held together by ligaments that glistened with fluids of uncertain origin. Imagine a head that was too large and a face that held within it elements of multiple species, arranged not through evolution but through deliberate assembly. Imagine eyes that reflected no light but somehow conveyed an impression of vision, so comprehensive that it encompassed past and future as well as present. All of this, but wrong. All of this, but shaped by a consciousness that did not believe in the boundaries that separated categories. All of this, but constructed according to principles that human anatomy did not account for and evolution could not produce. "That is not the real shape," Daniel said. He was no longer standing with us. He was wading into the water. "That is only what it is showing us because our minds cannot process the real shape. The real shape exists partially outside our dimensional framework. What we are seeing is a projection, an approximation designed to be comprehensible while still maintaining the core truth of its alien nature." "Daniel, come back," I called to him, but he was already thigh-deep in the water, moving toward the thing with the gait of a man walking toward an old friend whom he has not seen in years. The thing made a sound. It was not a roar or a shriek or any categorizable animal vocalization. It was a sound that seemed to contain multiple frequencies occupying the same space, a kind of layered communication that I felt more than heard. It was a sound that seemed to contain meaning and emotion and history and prophecy all simultaneously. Then it reached for Daniel, and he did not resist. What followed I will not describe in detail. Descriptions would fail to convey the actual experience, and I suspect that detailing the specific mechanics of what I witnessed would damage something essential in whoever heard or read those details. I will say only this: Daniel did not die quickly. The thing that took him did not kill him cleanly. It treated his body with the kind of intimate attention that suggested it was learning through the act of observation what it meant to be human. And when Daniel finally ceased to exist as an entity capable of independent consciousness, I understood that part of whatever he had been absorbed into whatever that thing was. The rest of us ran. We reached the rafts as darkness fell completely. Christopher, Rachel, Amanda, Nicole, and I piled into the first raft with barely enough coordination to avoid capsizing. We abandoned the second raft and the supplies we had intended to carry. We pushed away from the inlet with an urgency that bordered on panic. The water was like black glass. Our paddles cut through it without resistance, but the effort seemed disproportionate to the distance we traveled. It was as if the water was working against us, viscous and resistant, as if something beneath the surface was creating a drag that should not exist. Behind us, the valley seemed to glow with a phosphorescence that had no natural source, and from the water I heard voices. Not Lauren's voice or Daniel's voice or Matthew's voice, though I heard elements of all of them. These were voices that had learned how to speak by studying human speech patterns and then inventing variations on those patterns in ways that human vocal apparatus could not produce. These were voices saying words that almost made sense, almost formed meanings that the human mind could latch onto and interpret. I turned forward and did not look back again until we had traveled for what felt like hours in complete darkness, navigating by feel and by memory rather than by sight. When I finally did turn around, the valley was completely invisible. There was only water and darkness, and the sense of being on an ocean far too deep for anything human to comprehend. We paddled for 18 hours without stopping, driven by an urgency that transcended rational analysis. No one spoke. No one suggested we rest. We simply moved forward, propelled by a collective understanding that stopping meant submitting to something we could not name. At dawn on the morning after our departure, we encountered a fishing vessel. The crew that pulled us from the water were weathered men with decades of Alaskan maritime experience. They did not ask many questions initially. They provided us with blankets and hot coffee and space to exist in something approximating safety. It was only later, after we had been delivered to Anchorage, that the questioning began. The authorities wanted to know what had happened. They wanted a rational accounting of events that were fundamentally irrational. We told them that Matthew had fallen. We told them that Lauren had become lost during evacuation. We told them that Daniel had drowned attempting to reach the emergency raft. We told them that the expedition had experienced a series of catastrophic accidents that resulted in the death of 3 people. We did not tell them about what we had seen. We did not mention the thing that rose from the water, or the impossible geometry of its form, or the way it had communicated in frequencies that seemed to bypass language and address something more primal in human consciousness. Christopher kept his journal. He recorded everything with meticulous accuracy. When authorities asked to examine it, he refused. He has continued to refuse for the years that have passed since that expedition. I respect his discretion. Some knowledge is more dangerous than the danger it describes. Rachel left Alaska entirely. She moved to the Pacific Northwest and took work as an independent conservation consultant. She no longer hunts. She will not discuss our expedition, though sometimes I wonder if she experiences what I experience, a kind of permanent attentiveness, a sense that something was learned or imprinted during those days that continues to shape perception in subtle ways. She will not respond to my attempts to make contact, which I understand. Some shared experiences create bonds. Others create wounds that are too severe to reconcile even with others who shared them. Nicole never fully recovered from discovering her partner's body in that geometric arrangement. She spent 6 months in intensive psychiatric care following our return. The medical staff determined that her psychological crisis was related to trauma and grief, which is partially true. But I saw something in her eyes that suggested her diagnosis was incomplete. I saw someone who had glimpsed a dimension of reality that made her previous understanding of existence feel naive and fragile. She eventually moved in with her sister in New Hampshire. She took a job at a library. She has created a life of order and routine and familiar things, as if establishing sufficient routine could create a barrier against the knowledge that disorder and familiarity can be replaced with alien horror at any moment. Amanda remained in Alaska. She continued to work in environmental conservation, but she focused exclusively on urban planning and habitat management in populated areas. She did not return to remote wilderness. I saw her once, approximately 3 years after our expedition. She looked like a woman who had been fundamentally rewired, whose understanding of cause and effect and rational planning had been permanently altered. We did not speak. We both understood that our shared experience was too large to fit into casual conversation. As for me, I have continued to work as a guide, though I have restricted my operations to day trips and established trails. I do not venture into the remote wilderness that I once loved. I do not camp overnight in places where the boundary between human civilization and wilderness is thin enough to be permeable. I tell people that I encountered a wildlife emergency that convinced me to change my career focus. This is technically true, though the lie of omission is larger than the truth of statement. At night, I often experience something that might be called dreams, or might be called communication. I find myself in the water again, moving towards something vast and partially visible. I find myself in conversations conducted in those layered frequencies that contain multiple meanings simultaneously, and I find myself understanding things about the nature of consciousness and category, and the fragile nature of the boundaries that separate human civilization from the wild. I do not believe these are merely dreams. I believe they are a continuation of something that began in that valley, something that will not fully resolve until I have been changed in some fundamental way that makes me compatible with the knowledge I have acquired. Christopher once told me, in one of the rare times he discussed our expedition after returning to Anchorage, that he thought the thing we encountered was not malevolent. He thought it was curious. He thought it was attempting to understand what we were in the same way we attempt to understand the animals we hunt and observe. But our curiosity does not require the death of its subjects, I told him. No, Christopher replied. Our curiosity does not. but our curiosity is constrained by the fact that we share the same biological category as the subjects of our observation. If you were trying to understand the nature of water, you would have to immerse yourself in it. You would have to spend time in its medium, understanding its properties from within rather than from without. I think it was doing something similar. I think it was trying to understand what we were by spending time inside us. By consuming Matthew and Daniel and partially consuming Lauren, it was gaining knowledge. That does not make it evil. It makes it fundamentally alien in ways that make human morality irrelevant. I have often thought about what Daniel said before he walked into the water. He believed that the thing was not trying to kill us, that it was trying to communicate something about the nature of this place and our position within it. He believed that by offering himself, he was somehow protecting the rest of us, redirecting the thing's attention away from Rachel and Christopher and Amanda and Nicole and me. Whether that is true or merely a narrative interpretation applied to horror for the purposes of coping, I cannot determine, but I know that we did escape. I know that we reached civilization and that we have survived the years that have followed. I know that our story was filed away in official reports and gradually forgotten by everyone except those who lived it. What I do not know is whether our escape was permitted or whether we simply managed to survive by luck and circumstance while something vastly older and vastly more intelligent allowed us to depart. 7 years have passed since we left that valley in Kenai Fjords. I am telling this account now because I believe the boundary between what we consider real and what we consider impossible is beginning to shift again. I have monitored reports from that region. I have maintained contact with Christopher, though our conversations are conducted through careful language designed to obscure from observers what we are actually discussing. And I have observed signs that suggest the expedition was not a conclusion but merely the opening of a conversation that continues to unfold in ways I do not fully understand. Recently, a new hiking group entered Kenai Fjords. They were attempting to establish a research station in approximately the same valley where our expedition occurred. They did not complete their mission. Their supplies were found in disarray at the inlet. 4 members of the team were never located. 2 returned to civilization with psychological injuries so severe they currently reside in care facilities where they do not interact with the outside world. The remaining members of the group have submitted official reports documenting wildlife disturbances and environmental hazards, descriptions that are technically accurate while maintaining a careful distance from the truth of what actually transpired. I have also begun to wonder if I myself am reliable as a narrator of these events. I notice that my perception of time has become unreliable in certain ways. I notice that I sometimes remember conversations I did not actually have and forget others that definitely occurred. I notice that my dreams have become increasingly detailed and increasingly difficult to distinguish from waking experience. I notice that I am drawn to water in ways that feel compulsive, driven by an impulse I do not fully control. Christopher believes that those of us who survived are being slowly integrated into something. He thinks we are becoming translators, entities that exist partially in the human world and partially in the world of the thing we encountered. He thinks that our role is not yet complete, that we have been marked for purposes that extend beyond our individual survival or understanding. I do not know if he is correct, but I know that when I stand at the edge of a body of water and listen carefully, I can hear those layered voices speaking in frequencies that human language cannot quite capture. I can hear meaning flowing through patterns that seem to contain history and prophecy, and something that might be love expressed in ways that have no human analog. I know that sometimes, when I am walking through wilderness, I find myself looking at the trees and the mountains and the distant horizons not as obstacles to be navigated, but as entities possessing an agency and an intelligence that my previous training had trained me to ignore. I know that the boundary between observer and observed has become permeable in ways that I cannot reverse. I know that if I were to return to Kenai Fjords, I would not attempt to escape again. I know that I would walk into the water as Daniel did, and I would offer myself to the thing that dwells in that place, and I would allow whatever dissolution and integration that action entailed. But I continue to live in human civilization, in towns and cities where the wilderness is constrained and the boundaries are maintained. I continue to guide day hikers on established trails. I continue to avoid the remote places that call to me with an insistence that sometimes feels overwhelming. And I continue to tell this story, first to myself in my dreams and now to you, whoever you are who have listened to this account. You should know something crucial, and I say this with the gravity it deserves. Everything I have told you is literally true in the way that truth functions within the narrative of events as they occurred. But truth is also a kind of category, like the categories that separate animal from human, from mineral, from something that exists partially in all those categories and partially in dimensions that the human eye has not yet learned to perceive. There is something in the wilderness that is learning to speak in ways we can understand. There is something that has demonstrated an interest in human consciousness and human perception that goes beyond predation or territoriality. There is something that will continue to learn and will continue to reach out from the gaps in our understanding, the spaces we have not yet mapped or explained away. I do not know if this constitutes a warning or an invitation. I suspect the distinction between those two categories is not as absolute as we have been trained to believe. What I do know is this: if you travel to remote places, if you venture into wilderness where the human boundary is thin and permeable, you are not as alone as you believe. You are being observed by intelligences operating according to rules and categories that your language and your systems of knowledge have not yet accounted for. These intelligences are not hostile by your definition, but they are not benign by your understanding. And if you find yourself in a place where the water seems too black, where the forests seem too attentive, where you hear sounds that almost form meaning but never quite resolve into language, I recommend something that may feel counterintuitive. Do not run. Do not hide. Do not attempt to maintain the boundary between your world and theirs. Because boundaries, I have learned, are far more permeable than we are conditioned to believe. And the things that exist in the spaces between categories are far more interested in understanding us than we are prepared to acknowledge. The expedition to Kenai Fjords was not a tragedy. It was a conversation, and I suspect the conversation is not yet finished. The first thing you need to understand is that some places remember. They hold on to moments. They breathe with an intention that has nothing to do with weather patterns or geological shifts. St. Elias National Park in Alaska is one of those places, and I learned this truth too late to do anything about it except document what happened and hope someone reads this and decides not to make the same mistake. My name is being withheld because that is still something within my control. 8 of us gathered at the base camp in early July, drawn by promises of pristine wilderness and the kind of silence you can only find where human footsteps have barely left impressions. We were experienced outdoors people, not reckless, not naive, or so we believed. Jeffrey Turner arrived first, a man of 52 with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life studying terrain and reading landscapes. He was a former guide, someone who had walked these mountains more times than most people could count hiking trails. He brought his expertise and his confidence in equal measure. Cynthia Phillips came next, 67 years old and tougher than the cold itself. She was retired from forestry work, and she moved through the camp with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades preparing for expeditions. Her eyes were kind, but they were also constantly assessing, measuring, evaluating. Adam Campbell was younger, 36, a hunter who specialized in tracking elk through the high country. He carried himself with the quiet competence of someone who had spent countless seasons in wild places. His knowledge of animal behavior was exceptional, and he volunteered to handle much of our movement through the backcountry. Kelly Parker, 42, was a wildlife photographer who had come to capture images of the golden eagle population during their summer activity. She had long, dark hair and eyes that saw composition in everything. She moved carefully, mindfully, as if afraid to disturb the perfect geometry of the world around her. Patrick Evans, 64, was our group coordinator. He had organized this expedition for the past 3 years, and he knew the routes, the campsites, and the seasonal patterns of St. Cast. Elias better than any map could convey. He was the kind of man who led from behind, making sure everyone was cared for before worrying about himself. Erin Edwards, 34, worked as a physician's assistant, though we did not think to ask her medical expertise might become relevant. She was quiet, observant, with a dry sense of humor that emerged during difficult moments. She hiked with the kind of endurance that suggested she had spent her life moving through challenging terrain. Jonathan Collins, 49, was a preservation specialist working for a nonprofit focused on maintaining wilderness spaces. His role was to document the condition of various areas we would traverse and to ensure we left no trace of our presence. He was meticulous in ways that sometimes seemed obsessive, but we understood the value in his precision. Brenda Stewart was 57, the quiet heart of our group. She did not speak often, but when she did, people listened. She had a way of seeing things that others missed. On the second day of our trek, she would be the first to notice that something was wrong with the birds. We established our base camp near the Seward Glacier, about 4 miles from the road. That first night was perfect. The kind of perfect that makes you forget to be cautious. We cooked dinner over a camp stove, told stories about previous expeditions, and watched the light linger in the sky long after the sun had technically set. Brenda mentioned that she had not heard any birds all day. Patrick laughed and said that perhaps they were sleeping. Adam nodded in agreement. It was July, he said. The birds sang in the early morning and the evening. During the middle of the day, they rested in the shade. We accepted this explanation because it made sense. On the morning of the second day, we began our longer trek into the park. The plan was to traverse deeper into the wilderness, moving toward areas that fewer people had ever seen. We would camp for 2 nights in the high country, then return to base camp, resupply, and head into a different region. It was a well-planned itinerary, considered and safe. The hiking that day was more difficult than anticipated. The elevation gain was substantial, and although we were all capable, there was something about the terrain that seemed resistant to our passage. Trails that should have been clear appeared overgrown. Rock scrambles that the guidebooks described as straightforward contained surprising obstacles. By midday, we had fallen almost 3 hours behind our planned schedule. Jeffrey stopped us at the 2-mile mark and suggested we take a longer break than planned. He was concerned about the pace, about whether we would make the next campsite before dark. We sat on a ridge and ate lunch and drank water. Kelly took photographs of the glaciers visible in the distance. Jonathan made notes about the vegetation patterns. It was during this break that Adam asked about the tracks. He had found them while assisting Aaron across a particularly steep section of the trail. They were in the dirt near a small stream, and they were large, he said, larger than a black bear, larger than anything that should have been in this region. Patrick examined them and said they were probably old prints, eroded by weather and time into something that looked larger than it actually was. Cynthia bent down and looked closely. She did not immediately agree with Patrick, but she did not disagree either. She simply stood up and suggested we move on. Jeffrey asked Adam to lead us. He said that Adam had the best instincts for reading landscape and movement, and if there was anything ahead that we should know about, Adam would sense it first. We continued walking into the afternoon. The sky had begun to change. Clouds were moving in from the north, the kind of clouds that form in the mountains and carry weather that arrives with brutal indifference to human plans. By 4 o'clock, the wind had picked up significantly. That is when we heard the sound. It came from somewhere ahead of us, somewhere in the direction we were walking. It was not a sound I had ever heard before, and I still cannot describe it accurately. It was not quite an animal sound. It was not quite something else. It was long and rising and falling, like wind but with intention, like a voice but not a voice. It seemed to come from the ground and the sky simultaneously. Adam stopped. He held up his hand for us to stop as well. The sound continued. It rose and fell for nearly 30 seconds. Then it stopped abruptly, as if something had turned off a switch. Kelly asked what it was. Adam did not answer. Jeffrey looked at Cynthia. Cynthia looked at Patrick. Patrick looked at Aaron. Aaron looked at Jonathan. Jonathan looked at Brenda. Brenda was staring ahead at the trail, her entire body rigid, her hands clenched into fists. We stood there for 5 minutes without moving. The wind pushed against us from multiple directions, confused and chaotic. The light was beginning to dim. The temperature was dropping. Patrick suggested we move quickly to the next campsite. It was only another mile. We had maybe 2 hours of useful light remaining. We could push through and set up camp before full darkness arrived. We began walking again. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were our footsteps on the rocky path, the wind, and occasionally the distant call of what might have been an eagle or might have been something else entirely. The campsite was located on a flat stretch of terrain near a small lake. As we approached it, I noticed that there were no animals anywhere. No birds, no squirrels, no sign of life beyond the plants themselves. We set up our tents quickly and efficiently, moving with practiced precision. Patrick organized the food storage. Aaron made sure everyone was hydrated and warm. Cynthia checked each tent for security. Nobody wanted to spend time outside after dark. That night, we built a fire, but we did not stay around it for long. The wind was moving the flames in strange patterns, and the light from the fire seemed to make the darkness beyond it even deeper and more impenetrable. I lay in my tent and listened to the wind. I listened to the sound of the others settling into their sleeping bags in the adjacent tents. I listened to the particular silence of a place that is paying attention to you, watching you, deciding what you mean to it. Sometime near midnight, I heard the sound again. This time, it was much closer. This time, it seemed to be moving around the perimeter of our camp, circling slowly, methodically, as if something were walking the border of our presence and deciding whether it wanted to venture inward. I heard Adam unzip his tent. I heard him talking to Jeffrey in low tones. I heard Cynthia say she had been awake for hours. I heard Patrick trying to organize some kind of response, some kind of plan. But there was nothing to plan for. There was nothing to fight. There was only the sound and the knowledge that whatever was making that sound was aware of us, and that awareness was not benign. Morning came slowly. The sun rose behind clouds that seemed determined to block out as much light as possible. We emerged from our tents one by one, each of us moving with the careful deliberation of people who had not slept well and were not entirely sure what the new day would bring. Brenda was already awake when I emerged. She was standing near the lake, looking out at the water, and she did not turn around as I approached. She asked if I had heard it too. I said yes. She nodded slowly and said that it had been circling the camp for hours. She had counted the times it passed the back of her tent. 17 times. Always moving clockwise. Always at approximately the same distance from the tents. Always with that terrible sound that was not quite a sound. The others emerged gradually. Nobody wanted to speak directly about what had happened. Jeffrey suggested we review our water purification supplies. Cynthia mentioned that we should check the food storage to make sure nothing had been disturbed. Adam began breaking down the cooking area with focused precision. It was as though we were all engaged in a collective agreement to not speak about the thing that had circled our camp all night. But Patrick eventually called us together. He said we needed to discuss what to do. Our planned route had been to continue deeper into the park, further from the road and the base camp. Now, he said, we had a choice. We could continue with the plan, we could return to base camp and reassess, or we could modify our route and move to one of the other designated campsites that was closer to established trails and more frequently traveled areas. The vote was not unanimous, but it was clear. Everyone except Adam wanted to return to base camp. Adam argued that retreating would accomplish nothing. Whatever was in these mountains was in these mountains. Distance from the base camp would not protect us. He said that what we had experienced sounded like an animal, and all animals operated on patterns of behavior. If we could identify the pattern, we could predict the movement and avoid it. Aaron asked if he could identify what kind of animal. Adam could not answer. He said he had never heard anything like it. The closest comparison was a wolf, but no wolf made that particular sound. It was something else, something different. We compromised. We would return to base camp, but we would spend the afternoon consulting maps and discussing a new approach. We would then make a decision about whether to continue with a modified expedition or to end the trip entirely. The walk back to base camp took almost 8 hours. We moved slowly and carefully, and we made frequent stops. Every sound made us pause. Every shadow seemed potentially significant. By the time we reached the base camp near the Seward Glacier, it was nearly dark. We did not speak much that evening. We built a fire and sat around it. The wind had diminished, and the night was relatively calm, but the calm felt temporary, as though it were simply a pause in something larger and more dangerous. Cynthia eventually broke the silence. She said she had remembered something. Many years ago, when she was younger, she had worked as a forestry maintenance specialist in this region. She had been assigned to clear trails and mark routes. One of the old guides she had worked with had mentioned things that lived in St. Elias that were not on any official list. He had told her that the park had areas that tourists, and even most park rangers, did not go to, areas where the animals were different, where the behavior of things that walked on 4 legs was different. Patrick asked what he meant by different. Cynthia said the guide had used a word she had never forgotten. He had said that some creatures in the high country were not just animals, they were something between. Something that could mimic other creatures but was not actually any of them. Jonathan said this sounded like folklore. Cynthia said folklore came from experience. Folklore came from people describing things they had actually encountered and then passing those descriptions down through generations. Aaron asked if Cynthia believed that what they had encountered was something that could mimic creatures. Cynthia said she did not know what she believed. She only knew that in her entire career in wilderness management, she had never heard a sound like the one they had heard. And the fact that it had spent the entire night circling their camp suggested that it was either very curious or very interested in studying them. Adam said studying them suggested intelligence. Studying suggested patience. Studying suggested a long-term interest in what the subject of the study was doing and where they were going. The fire was dying. None of us wanted to add more wood. We sat in the increasing darkness and listened to the sounds of the mountain night around us. Kelly had not spoken since we returned. She had sat apart from the group, reviewing the photographs she had taken before things had gone wrong. As darkness fell completely, she approached Patrick and asked if she could look at the maps again. Patrick brought them out. Kelly pointed to a location about 3 miles from where we had camped. She said that yesterday afternoon, when we were taking our break, she had shot a series of photographs toward the ridgeline above us. She had been trying to capture the patterns of ice on the distant peaks. She showed us the photographs on the back of her camera. Most of them were beautiful alpine landscapes, glaciers catching the late afternoon light, rock formations casting complex shadows. But in 3 consecutive photographs, taken over the course of about 2 minutes, there was something else. On the ridgeline, silhouetted against the sky, there was a figure. It was standing upright, on 2 legs, watching down at us. It was clearly animal in shape, but also clearly not. The proportions were wrong. The angles of the limbs were subtly off in ways that made it difficult to look at for too long. In the second photograph, it appeared to have moved closer. In the third photograph, it was no longer there, but off to the side, just barely visible, there were what looked like tracks in the snow, many tracks, as if multiple creatures had been moving across the ridgeline. We stared at these photographs for a long time. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. Jonathan eventually asked if these could be digital artifacts. Could the camera have created these images due to some malfunction? Kelly said no. She knew her equipment. She knew what these photographs showed. Brenda said that it had been watching us. Whatever it was, it had been on the ridgeline, and it had been watching us the entire time we were in the high country. And whatever had circled our camp last night had been the same thing. It had been studying us, learning about us, deciding something about us. Patrick stood up and said we were going to leave in the morning. Regardless of anyone else's opinion, he was leaving. He would take the vehicle and drive back to the main road. Anyone who wanted to come was welcome. Anyone who wanted to stay behind was making their own decision. Cynthia said she was going. Aaron said she was going. Jonathan said he was going. Kelly said she was going. Jeffrey looked at Adam and then at Brenda. Jeffrey said he had spent his entire life in mountains and wilderness areas. He had encountered bears and wolves and mountain lions. He had been chased and threatened and forced to make decisions that kept him alive. He understood danger. He understood predators. But he did not understand this. He did not understand something that watched with intelligence, that circled with purpose, that seemed interested in something beyond simple hunting and feeding. He said that in all his years, he had heard stories that the older guides would tell during long nights at remote camps, stories about things that were not quite animals and not quite human. Stories about creatures that could become other creatures. Stories about the spaces between the categories we used to divide up the world. He said he was going to stay. He wanted to know what it was. He wanted to understand. Adam said he was staying as well. Brenda said nothing. But when morning came, her tent was still in camp. We prepared to leave at dawn. The night had passed without incident, and we had all slept fitfully, waking at the slightest sounds. Patrick drove away with Cynthia, Aaron, Jonathan, and Kelly just after sunrise. They were heading directly to the nearest town, about 4 hours of driving. Patrick had made me promise to call the ranger station if we encountered any further problems. I told him I would. Jeffrey, Adam, Brenda, and I remained at base camp. We spent the morning reviewing maps and discussing what we thought we knew. Jeffrey believed that whatever had circled our camp was aware of us as individuals. It had singled us out somehow, marked us, decided that we were worth a sustained interest. He said that in his experience, animals did not generally behave this way. Animals hunted, or they avoided, or they were curious in brief, violent bursts. They did not maintain a sustained, methodical interest in human subjects over the course of many hours. Adam disagreed slightly. He said that some animals did maintain interest. Lions and leopards were known to track and study prey for extended periods. They learned behaviors. They planned. but Adam admitted that he had never heard of anything that behaved exactly like what we had encountered. Brenda listened and did not contribute much. She seemed to be listening to something beyond our conversation, something in the spaces between our words. By afternoon, we decided to attempt something new. We would return to the high country, but this time during daylight hours. We would move to the specific ridgeline that Kelly had photographed. We would search for physical evidence of what had been there, tracks, scat, anything that might help us understand what we were dealing with. I did not want to go. I said so explicitly. There seemed to me to be no good reason to venture back into the territory where the thing had been watching us. But the others were determined, and I did not want to remain alone at base camp. We packed light and started hiking around 2 o'clock. The goal was to reach the ridgeline before dark, spend perhaps an hour investigating, and then return to base camp in the remaining light. It was not an ideal plan, but it was better than staying still. The hike was uneventful until we reached the area where we had previously taken our break. As we approached it, Adam suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. He was looking at the ground. There were tracks here, many tracks, more tracks than a single animal could have made. They seemed to crisscross the area repeatedly, as though something had been walking back and forth across this section for an extended time. The tracks were large and deep. They looked like they could have been made by a large canine, but the claw marks were positioned strangely. The spacing between each print was inconsistent, sometimes suggesting a four-legged gait, sometimes suggesting something that occasionally moved on 2 legs. Jeffrey knelt down and examined them closely. He said they were fresh, very fresh. The edges of the prints were sharp and unworn. The tracks had been made within the last several hours. As we continued along the trail, the tracks became more numerous and more chaotic. It was as though something had been traveling in all directions simultaneously, which was impossible. Tracks did not work that way. When we reached the ridgeline, we found more evidence. There were areas where the snow had been disturbed extensively, areas where something appeared to have been moving in circles, around and around a central point, and there were marks on the rocks. Deep gouges, as though something with very large claws had been climbing the ridge face, pulling itself up and dragging itself along the stone. Brenda found something first. It was partially hidden beneath an overhang of rock. She pulled it out carefully and held it up to the light. It was a piece of fabric. It was old and faded and dark, and it looked like it might have come from clothing. It looked like leather, actually, very old leather, treated with something that had preserved it for a very long time. Jeffrey took it from her and examined it closely. He said it had been here for years, perhaps decades, but it had been disturbed recently. It had been moved from wherever it had originally been lying. Someone or something had pulled it out and left it on top of the rocks, where it would be easily found. Adam asked why something would do that. Why would a wild animal move an old piece of fabric and position it prominently? Jeffrey did not answer immediately. When he did answer, he said that he did not think we were dealing with something that was entirely wild. Wild animals did not engage in this kind of behavior. The wind had picked up again. It was moving through the ridge area with increasing force, making it harder to hear and harder to see clearly. The sun was lower in the sky than I had realized. We had perhaps an hour and a half of useful light remaining. I suggested we should leave. The others seemed to agree, though Adam made one final suggestion. He wanted to mark the ridgeline on the map, the exact spot where Kelly had taken the photographs. He wanted to know if whatever it was would return to this location. He wanted to establish whether the ridgeline was a preferred position or if the thing simply passed through here occasionally. We marked the location and began walking back toward base camp. That is when we heard the sound. Not at a distance this time, but close, very close. It came from somewhere above us on the ridge, somewhere just out of sight. Adam started moving toward it. Jeffrey grabbed him and pulled him back. He said no. He said we were leaving now. He said that pursuing sounds in the darkness of the mountains at dusk was how people died. We moved back down the trail quickly, not running, because running in this terrain was dangerous, but moving with focused urgency. Behind us, we could hear movement. Something was following us down the ridge. We could hear the scrape of claws on stone. We could hear the crunch of snow. We could hear breathing. Brenda was moving ahead of us, and she was moving faster than I had seen anyone move in this terrain. Her eyes were focused. Her body language had changed. It was as though the proximity to the thing behind us had flipped a switch in her, transforming her from observer to actor. We descended the ridgeline and reached the main trail. The thing behind us stopped pursuing. We could still hear it above us, still moving, but it was no longer getting closer. When we reached base camp, it was almost fully dark. We immediately began gathering our equipment. We were not discussing this decision. We were implementing it. We were leaving. Jeffrey started the vehicle. Adam gathered the remaining gear. Brenda began taking down the tents. I started packing the food supplies into the vehicle. As I was doing this, I noticed something. The tracks at the camp had multiplied. While we had been gone, while we had been on the ridgeline, something had visited the base camp. There were tracks everywhere. Tracks that circled each tent, tracks that lead to and from the vehicle, tracks that suggested that more than one thing had been here. I pointed this out to Jeffrey. He looked at the tracks and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said that we should have paid attention to Cynthia. We should have left when she did. Within 20 minutes, we had the camp essentially dismantled. We put the remaining supplies and equipment into the vehicle in no particular order. We simply wanted to be driving away from this place. As Jeffrey was starting the engine, I looked out the window toward the ridgeline we had just descended. There, silhouetted against the last light of the dying day, were multiple figures. They were standing upright, on two legs, watching as we prepared to leave. There were at least 5 of them, possibly more. They stood absolutely still, and they were watching us with an intensity that I could feel even at this distance. Jeffrey did not look at them. He simply drove away. The drive back toward the main road was tense and silent. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the vehicle moving over the rough terrain and the wind outside. Jeffrey drove carefully, paying close attention to the paths that we had used to get into the park. The darkness was nearly complete, and the headlights seemed to be barely adequate to navigate the rough ground. About 40 minutes into the drive, Adam asked if we were being followed. Jeffrey did not answer immediately. He checked the mirrors repeatedly, looking for any sign of lights or movement behind us. He said that he did not think we were being followed by vehicle, but he said he could not guarantee that we were not being followed by something else. The concept seemed to make him uncomfortable, as though by speaking it aloud, he was making it more real. Brenda had been completely silent since we had left the base camp. She sat in the passenger seat with her eyes closed, and she was breathing slowly and deliberately, as though she were engaged in some kind of meditative practice. I asked if she was okay. She opened her eyes and turned to look at me. She said that she had been thinking about something that had occurred to her while we were being watched on the ridgeline. She said that the figures we had seen had felt familiar in some way, not in a way that suggested she had encountered them before, but in a way that suggested she recognized what they were. Adam asked what she meant. Brenda said that throughout her career in wilderness work, she had read a lot of historical accounts of explorers and settlers in these regions. She had read journals and letters from people who had encountered things they could not categorize, things that they had described in ways that were confusing and contradictory. Animals that walked like humans, humans that appeared to have the features of animals, things that could not be explained by conventional taxonomy. She said that these accounts had always been dismissed as folklore or misidentification, or the confused observations of people who were frightened and tired. But what if they were not? What if they were accurate descriptions of something that was actually present in these wild places? Jeffrey asked if she was suggesting that what we had encountered fit these historical descriptions. Brenda said yes. She said she thought that what we had been dealing with was exactly what those earlier explorers and settlers had been trying to describe. And she said she thought that it had been here the entire time, that it had not traveled to this location. This was its home. This was where it had been for generations. The vehicle suddenly lurched. Jeffrey had hit something, or something had hit the vehicle. We all braced ourselves. Jeffrey maintained control and kept driving. In the mirror, I could see multiple shapes moving alongside the vehicle in the darkness. They were keeping pace with us. They were running on the same rough terrain that we were barely managing to drive over, and they were running easily, effortlessly, as though the rough ground presented no challenge to them whatsoever. Jeffrey accelerated. The vehicle bounced and jostled over the terrain, and I was thrown against the door. Adam braced himself against the front seat. Brenda did not move. She continued to stare ahead with an expression of perfect calm. One of the shapes moved ahead of us in the darkness. Jeffrey swerved to avoid it, nearly tipping the vehicle. We recovered and continued accelerating. The shapes were not attacking. They were not trying to stop us. They were simply running alongside us, keeping pace, and appearing to observe our movement toward escape. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes, we reached the road. The transition from the rough mountain terrain to the actual highway was jarring. The vehicle suddenly had traction and stability. Jeffrey did not slow down. He drove faster and faster, putting distance between us and the mountains. I looked behind us. The shapes were no longer visible. They had stopped at the boundary between the park and the road. They were not following onto the highway. Brenda spoke for the first time since we had begun driving. She said that the thing was territorial. It was staying within the boundaries of its territory. It did not follow beyond the space that it had claimed and occupied. Jeffrey said that this was some small comfort. At least we could drive away from it. At least we had the knowledge that it would not pursue us beyond certain boundaries. But Brenda said that this was not necessarily comforting. She said that knowing it was territorial meant that there were other places, other parks, other mountain ranges where similar things might be present. The concept of territorial behavior suggested that there were multiple territories, multiple populations, multiple regions where these creatures existed. Adam asked what she was suggesting. Brenda said she was suggesting that what we had encountered was not unique. There were more of them, many more of them, and there were places where they were so prevalent that they had shaped the behavior and the beliefs of the people who lived there. The drive to the nearest town took about 5 hours. We arrived in the early morning hours. Jeffrey drove directly to the police station and reported what we had experienced. We explained that we had encountered what we believed to be an unusual animal in the backcountry of St. Elias National Park. We described the sounds and the behavior and the tracks. The officer who took our report listened patiently, and then he suggested that we had probably encountered a large predator, possibly a grizzly bear or a wolf. These animals were not common in St. Elias, but they did occasionally appear. We had been fortunate to escape without injury. We did not tell him about the photographs. Kelly had those. We did not tell him about the piece of fabric. Jeffrey was keeping that. We did not tell him about the figures standing on the ridgeline, watching us leave. There seemed to be no point. There was no language to describe what we had experienced that would not result in immediate dismissal and disbelief. We gave our names and contact information, though we did not provide complete details about our encounter. The officer recorded the basic facts and suggested that if we wanted to report any actual injuries or crimes, we were welcome to do so. We left the police station and went to a hotel. Adam and I shared a room. Jeffrey and Brenda had separate rooms, though Brenda came to our room several times during the day to discuss what had happened. The narrative that we had to develop for the other members of the expedition was careful and edited. We told them that we had encountered an unusual animal and had decided that the wise course of action was to leave the park. We did not specify what kind of animal. We did not mention the circling or the surveillance or the shapes on the ridgeline. Patrick called to check on us. He said that the group that had left the park had been discussing the situation extensively. They wanted to know if we were safe, if we needed anything, if we would be willing to engage with the Ranger Service to file an official report. I told Patrick that we were safe. I told him that the situation was not something that official reports would be particularly helpful with. I told him that I would like to simply move forward and not dwell on what had happened. He accepted this, though he seemed concerned. He said that Cynthia and Aaron were also concerned about us. He said they wanted to make sure that we knew we could contact them if we needed support. Over the next several days, as we prepared to leave the town and return to our homes, I began to process what had happened. I began to understand that what we had encountered in St. Elias was not something that could be categorized using standard biological or zoological frameworks. Brenda had mentioned that in the historical records, these creatures were often described in ways that suggested they could change their form. They could appear as animals and then as humans and then as something between. The Navajo people, she said, had words for these things. She had forgotten the exact words, but she remembered that they referred to beings that had learned to walk in the skins of animals, that had given up their humanity to become something else. She said she thought that what we had encountered was exactly these things, and she said she thought that the reason they had not killed us was not because they could not, but because they were studying us. They were watching to see how we would react. They were learning our patterns and our behaviors so that they could better understand human beings in general. This was an idea that was hard to accept, but it was also an idea that explained much of what we had experienced. The circling of the camp, the surveillance on the ridgeline, the running alongside our vehicle without attacking. These behaviors made sense if the creatures were engaged in research rather than predation. Jeffrey asked if she thought they would study others. If other hikers and campers came to the park, would they be subjected to the same surveillance? Brenda said yes. She said that until people understood what was actually present in these wild places, they would continue to enter that territory without proper awareness or preparation, and the creatures would continue to watch and learn and study, and occasionally they would decide that a particular group was worth more intensive investigation. Adam asked if she thought we should try to warn people, if we should attempt to communicate what we had learned to the Park Service or to the public in general. Brenda said no. She said that people would not believe us. She said that the creatures had existed in these mountains for generations precisely because people did not believe they were there. Disbelief was a form of protection. As long as people did not recognize what the creatures were, the creatures could continue to exist in relative safety. She said that by attempting to warn people, we would be breaking that agreement. We would be forcing people to either believe something that contradicted their understanding of the world or to dismiss our warnings and venture into the park anyway with false confidence. She said the best thing we could do was to remain silent, to keep what we had learned to ourselves, to let the mountains keep their secrets. I left Alaska 3 days after arriving in the town. I drove to the airport and caught a flight that took me away from the mountains and into the controlled spaces of civilization. I returned to my home and attempted to resume my normal life. But there was something that had changed. Something in me had been altered by what I had experienced in St. Elias National Park. I found myself researching. I found myself reading historical accounts and anthropological studies and folklore from regions where wild mountains still dominated the landscape. I found myself looking for patterns in the stories that different cultures had preserved, and I found those patterns. Over and over again, in cultures separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, the same basic narrative appeared. Beings that were not quite human and not quite animal. Beings that could change their form. Beings that existed in the liminal spaces between categories. The Navajo had words for these things. The Apache had stories about them. The tribes in the Pacific Northwest had legends about them. The peoples of Asia had ancient texts describing them. And every single one of these accounts suggested the same fundamental truth. They had always been there. They had always lived in wild places. They had always existed in relationship with human beings, sometimes as guardians, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as threats. And they continued to exist in the present day, watching and learning and maintaining their territorial boundaries. I reached out to the others who had been part of the expedition. Jeffrey had returned to his home in Montana, and he was no longer accepting communication about the expedition. Adam had taken a job in the Pacific Northwest, far from mountains, and when I called him, he said that he did not want to discuss St. Elias. Aaron had written an academic paper about wilderness medicine and survival scenarios, but it made no mention of the park or what had happened. Only Brenda was willing to continue the conversation. She sent me email correspondence over the next several months, sharing research that she had compiled, sharing histories that she had uncovered, sharing interpretations of the accounts we had both read. She sent me an article written by a researcher who specialized in indigenous traditions. The article discussed creatures called skinwalkers, beings that had the ability to take the form of animals and that were said to exist in wilderness areas throughout the American West. The article noted that accounts of skinwalker sightings had increased during periods of wilderness expansion and tourism, as though the creatures were being disturbed or displaced by human activity. Brenda wrote that she believed this was what we had encountered. She wrote that the creatures had been present in St. Elias National Park for far longer than the park had existed. They had been there when the mountain ranges were formed. They had watched the indigenous peoples who had lived in that region. They had observed the explorers and the settlers, and when they encountered us, they had been doing what they had always done. They had been watching. They had been studying. They had been deciding what we meant to the landscape that they inhabited. She wrote that she thought the most important thing we could understand was that these creatures were not fundamentally hostile. They were not monsters in the way that modern horror fiction portrayed monsters. They were simply beings with their own existence, their own territory, their own purposes that had nothing to do with human concerns or human categories. What made them dangerous was not malice, but simply the fact that they existed in spaces that human beings did not fully understand and did not fully respect. We entered their territory believing that we were the dominant species, that we could move through any landscape without facing serious consequences. But the mountains belonged to them long before they belonged to us. In Brenda's final email to me, sent almost a year after our expedition, she wrote something that I have thought about every day since. She wrote that the skinwalkers had been watching us because they were trying to understand if human beings were capable of genuine respect for the wilderness. She wrote that they were studying to see if we could learn to move through wild places with humility rather than with the assumption of dominance. She wrote that she believed we had failed that test. She believed that our response to what we encountered had been fear and escape rather than understanding and acceptance. She believed that we had proven to the skinwalkers that we were not ready to share the mountains with genuine respect. And she wrote that this meant that more people would encounter them. More hikers and campers and hunters would venture into the backcountry of Sreet, Elias National Park and beyond, carrying their cameras and their hunting rifles and their certainty that they belonged there. And the skinwalkers would continue to watch and to study and to wait for the day when humans finally understood what they were. I have not returned to St. Elias National Park since that summer. I have not attempted to return to the backcountry or to the high country. But I think about that place often. I think about the sound that circled our camp. I think about the figures watching from the ridgeline. I think about Brenda's belief that these creatures were not monsters but simply inhabitants of a landscape that belonged to them as much as it belongs to the mountains themselves. I have shared this account with you because I believe it is important that people understand what exists in the wild places that remain on this planet. I have shared this account because Brenda eventually changed her position. She came to believe that silence was not protective, that ignorance was not wisdom, that the only way forward was to tell the truth about what we had encountered, even if that truth contradicted everything that people thought they understood about the world. The mountains are still there. St. Elias National Park still exists, and people still venture into its backcountry seeking experiences and connections with wilderness. Some of them will hear sounds that they cannot identify. Some of them will see tracks that do not match any known animal. Some of them will look back at their photographs and see figures that should not be there. And when they do, I hope they remember this account. I hope they understand that what they have encountered is not a threat or a monster or a hallucination. It is simply a being that has decided that they are worth observing. It is simply a creature that is studying to understand how human beings will respond to the knowledge that they are not alone in the wilderness. How you respond to that knowledge is your choice. But I hope you choose respect. I hope you choose understanding. I hope that you succeed where we failed, and you demonstrate to the creatures of the mountains that human beings are finally capable of genuine humility in the face of the wild. The sound is still in my head sometimes, in the quiet moments late at night, the sound that was not quite wind and not quite voice, the sound that suggested intention and intelligence and a kind of patience that extends far beyond human comprehension. I hear it, and I remember that I am small. I remember that the mountains do not care about my presence or my absence. I remember that there are things in wild places that see me in ways I can never see them, and I am grateful for that knowledge. I am grateful that I know now what waits in the spaces beyond civilization. I am grateful that the skinwalkers chose to observe us rather than destroy us, because that observation was a form of mercy. It was a form of communication. It was the creature's way of saying that human beings are worth studying, worth understanding, worth watching to see if we will ever learn what it means to exist with genuine respect for a landscape that does not need us and never has. I'm going to share what happened during those 8 days in the vast wilderness of St. Elias National Park, and I need you to understand that every word of this account is true, even though the rational mind rebels against it. We arrived on a Thursday in late July. 8 of us packed into 2 vehicles heading toward the remote regions few tourists ever visit. The park sprawls across 6 million acres of untamed terrain, and we had permits to explore a section most people only see in photographs. Jeffrey Turner organized the expedition. He was a businessman from Anchorage, the type who believed money could buy any experience. The rest of us were hired for our expertise. Cynthia Phillips served as our primary guide. She possessed the kind of knowledge that only comes from decades of backcountry work. Adam Campbell managed our equipment. Kelly Parker handled communications, though up there the radio was mostly ornament. On that first afternoon, we established base camp near a glacial lake whose water ran milky with ancient sediment. The sky stretched endlessly above us, a pale blue unmarred by clouds. Patrick Evans, our wildlife specialist, pointed out fresh grizzly tracks near the eastern perimeter. Nothing alarmed us then. The wilderness felt pristine, untouched, alive in the way only truly remote places can be. That night, Jonathan Collins mentioned the stories. He was the type of man who collected local folklore the way others collected photographs. Around the fire, with the temperature dropping toward freezing despite the summer season, Jonathan spoke of the skinwalker legends that persisted in regions like this. Cynthia told him to stop. She said certain stories didn't belong in certain places. The conversation died quickly after that. On the second day, we hiked toward a ridge overlooking the glacial system. 8 miles out, Aaron Edwards noticed something odd. Animal tracks, but not quite right. The prints appeared humanoid but larger, with claw marks extending from where fingers should be. Cynthia examined them carefully, and when she looked up, something in her expression had shifted. She said nothing but increased our pace back toward camp. That evening, Brenda Stewart claimed she heard something outside her tent, a sound like breathing, rhythmic and deliberate. When we checked, we found scratches on the fabric, deep gouges as though something with considerable strength had tested the material. Cynthia suggested a curious bear, but her voice carried doubt. In the morning, we moved camp to a new location 5 miles north. The weather changed rapidly on day 4. What had been clear skies transformed into overcast conditions by midday. A wind moved through the valleys, carrying with it an odor that none of us could identify. Jeffrey wanted to continue our planned route. Cynthia insisted on caution. They argued. Jeffrey's confidence, born from a life of winning through force of will, conflicted with Cynthia's instinct, forged through 100 seasons of reading the mountain's moods. That night, Patrick disappeared from his tent sometime between midnight and dawn. We searched the immediate area for 2 hours, before accepting that the darkness and terrain made any meaningful investigation impossible. Jeffrey wanted to contact the park ranger station. The radio crackled with interference, high-pitched static that seemed almost intentional in its persistence. Eventually, a distant voice acknowledged our emergency signal. The ranger advised us to remain in camp until daylight. He said bad weather was moving in from the north. As dawn broke gray and cold, we formed 3 search teams. Jonathan stayed with Kelly and Aaron to monitor camp. The rest of us spread out across the surrounding landscape, calling Patrick's name into the indifferent terrain. The mountain absorbed our voices as though we had never spoken at all. We found his jacket near the tree line, torn and marked with something dark. Cynthia knelt beside it, examining the material with the methodical care of someone who has learned to read violence written across fabric. She said nothing for a long time. That afternoon, the thing began appearing in glimpses. I saw it first, though I couldn't convince myself I was seeing anything real. A shadow moving with wrong proportions, bipedal but somehow more than human. It appeared briefly on a distant ridge, backlit against the pale sky. When I pointed, the others turned their heads, but the shape had already vanished into the permafrost scrub. Cynthia gathered us at camp as light began to fail. She spoke with the authority of someone who had ceased worrying about credibility or acceptance. The stories Jonathan had mentioned, she said, had roots deeper than folklore. What hunted in these places wasn't supernatural in any sense that allowed for comfort. It was entirely natural, a predator that had learned to walk on 2 legs, that understood human psychology well enough to induce maximum fear, that had evolved in the isolation of places like this for longer than any of us could comprehend. Jeffrey accused her of fear-talking. He said we were losing objectivity. He announced he was hiking out in the morning, regardless of conditions. Cynthia simply looked at him with an expression that combined pity with something harder to categorize. That night, Kelly heard breathing at the tent wall. Not outside, but somehow within the thin membrane, separating us from the darkness. The sound moved along the perimeter, methodical and patient. We lay still in our sleeping bags, scarcely breathing ourselves, aware that making noise might accelerate whatever waited beyond the fabric. By morning, the landscape had transformed. What had been rocky tundra appeared different, as though some essential quality had been stripped away. The shapes of rocks seemed wrong, and the distances between landmarks no longer made sense. Jeffrey insisted on his plan regardless. Cynthia packed his backpack with supplies without protest, as though she had already calculated the probable outcome and decided resistance was futile. He made it approximately 4 miles before the sounds began. We heard them from camp, carried on the wind that had risen with the sun. Sounds that might have been calls or might have been something attempting to form words in a throat that evolution had never intended for human speech. Cynthia made the decision to move southeast, toward a location where a river cut through the landscape. In the dark hours before dawn on the 7th day, while wind battered the tents and the temperature plummeted, we evacuated camp carrying only essential gear. Jonathan kept repeating that we should stay, that moving might increase our visibility. Cynthia didn't respond. She simply walked, and we followed. The extraction was complicated. The helicopter arrived 18 hours later, after the ranger station coordinated with park officials. We were technically still within established boundaries, still within the vast geometry of protected wilderness. The pilot said the storm had been severe, the worst system in 5 years. Of the 8 who entered St. Elias that July, 6 left. The official reports cite weather conditions and difficult terrain. They note that Jeffrey Turner was experienced in backcountry travel, that he likely lost his way in the storm. They mention that Patrick Evans probably encountered a grizzly in the pre-dawn darkness. The park rangers maintain that these were isolated incidents, tragic but not unusual for a region of such extreme conditions. Cynthia won't work as a guide anymore. Kelly gave notice at her communications job and moved to Seattle. Jonathan published a book about cryptids of North America, but it reads like the work of a man who is trying to convince himself of his own analysis. I return to that place sometimes in dreams, not the camp or the trails or the impossible vastness of the park. I return to a moment I never actually witnessed, a moment that exists now only as a kind of knowing that visits my sleeping mind. I see something moving through the stone and ice, bipedal and patient, carrying something that had been human until the moment it was caught. And I understand with absolute certainty that we didn't escape. We were allowed to leave, and the reason it permitted our departure remains the most disturbing mystery of all.